Imagine the sound of a freight train passing directly over your head, completely invisible, traveling at roughly 2,500 feet per second. That is the acoustic signature of a 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectile ripping through the atmosphere. When it impacts, it does not just explode, it reshapes the geography, turning reinforced concrete bunkers into pulverized dust and sending shockwaves deep into the earth that shatter the internal organs of anyone unlucky enough to be within the blast radius. This is not the work of a modern precision-guided cruise missile or a stealth bomber. This is the blunt force trauma delivered by a weapon system conceived before the invention of the microchip, a steel leviathan born in the shipyards of a bygone era. We are talking about the Iowa-class battleships, the ultimate expression of naval artillery, and their terrifying deployment to crush heavily fortified shore defenses. Welcome to the channel, where we strip away the political rhetoric and analyze the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of warfare. If you want to understand how military history is actually forged in steel, fire, and logistics, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and join our community of tactical analysts. Today, we are looking at one of the most fascinating tactical anomalies of the late 20th century. Why, in an era dominated by supersonic fighter jets, nuclear submarines, and over-the-horizon anti-ship missiles, would the United States military spend billions of dollars to drag World War II relics out of mothballs, just to park them off a hostile coastline? To understand this, we have to look past the nostalgia and dive deep into the strategic roots of naval gunfire support, a doctrine written in blood on the coral reefs of the Pacific and refined in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The story of the Iowa-class crushing modern shore defenses does not begin in the Persian Gulf or off the coast of Lebanon. It begins in the late 1930s. The United States Navy was watching the Imperial Japanese Navy construct the fast, heavily armed Congo-class battlecruisers. American war planners realized their existing dreadnoughts, moving at a sluggish 21 knots, would be left behind by the new fast carrier task forces. They needed a ship that could serve as an impenetrable anti-aircraft escort for the carriers, while possessing the speed to hunt down enemy cruisers and the armor to survive a slugfest with other capital ships. The result was the Vinson Trammell Act and the subsequent design of the Iowa class, a 45,000-ton hull packed with engines capable of generating 212,000 shaft horsepower, pushing the ship to a blistering 33 knots. But the true defining feature of these ships was their main battery, 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark VII naval rifles. These guns were originally designed to punch through the 18-inch thick steel armor plates of the Japanese Yamato-class battleships at a range of 20 miles. However, the naval battles of World War II fundamentally altered the battleship's job description. After the Battle of Midway, it became clear that aircraft carriers were the new queens of the sea, and battleship-to-battleship engagements became exceedingly rare. Instead, the United States Marine Corps found a new, desperate need for the battleships during the island-hopping campaigns. At the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, the Navy heavily relied on 5-inch guns from destroyers and cruisers to prep the landing beaches. The result was a disaster. The lighter shells simply bounced off the Japanese pillboxes, which were constructed of reinforced concrete and buried under layers of coral sand and palm logs. Marines hit the beaches and were slaughtered by intact defensive positions. The bitter lesson learned at Tarawa was that you cannot simply pepper a fortified bunker with light artillery. You have to obliterate it with high-capacity explosives. You need mass, you need kinetic energy, and you need a shell heavy enough to crack the earth open. From that point forward, at Kwajalein, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the 16-inch guns of the battleships became the ultimate bunker busters. This doctrine carried over into the Korean War, where the Iowas destroyed North Korean railway tunnels and artillery positions, and again into Vietnam, where the USS New Jersey was reactivated for Operation Sea Dragon in 1968. Off the coast of Vietnam, the New Jersey fired nearly 6,000 16-inch shells, devastating North Vietnamese supply lines and troop concentrations from a safe distance offshore. But by the late 1970s, the battleships were once again sitting silent in the reserve fleet, seemingly rendered obsolete by the advent of guided missile cruisers and nuclear attack submarines. So, what changed the strategic calculus? Enter the Cold War of the 1980s, the Reagan administration, and Secretary of the Navy John Lehman. The Soviet Union, under Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, had built a massive blue water navy designed to threaten American carrier strike groups. The crown jewels of the Soviet surface fleet were the Kirov-class nuclear-powered battlecruisers, massive ships armed with a terrifying array of long-range anti-ship missiles. The United States needed a rapid, highly visible counterpunch to project power and assert sea control, leading to the aggressive 600-ship Navy initiative. Lehman looked at the 4 Iowa-class hulls rusting in Philadelphia and Bremerton and saw a strategic opportunity. For roughly the cost of building one new Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, the Navy could reactivate a battleship, modernize its electronics, and strap modern cruise missiles onto its armored decks. It was a brilliant piece of strategic messaging, a floating fortress that signaled American resolve. But the true tactical value of the reactivated battleships lay in their ability to conduct sustained shore bombardment against heavily defended coastlines. Let us look at the force comparison and the staggering industrial effort required to bring these ships into the modern battlespace. By the time the USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin deployed to the Persian Gulf for Operation Desert Storm in 1991, they were bizarre hybrids of World War II mechanical engineering and late Cold War digital technology. The armor on these ships was staggering. They boasted 12.1 inches of Class A face-hardened steel on their main belt, and 17 inches of solid steel protecting the faces of the main gun turrets. In an era where modern warships were built with thin aluminium or light steel superstructures designed only to keep the weather out, the Iowa class was a floating anvil. A modern Exocet or Harpoon anti-ship missile designed to cripple a thin-skinned destroyer by detonating inside its hull would likely just scorch the paint on the side of a battleship's armored citadel. To this impregnable base, the Navy added 32 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles in armored box launchers, 16 RGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and 4 Phalanx close-in weapon systems to swat down incoming threats. But the adversaries they were meant to face had not remained static either. Let us examine the coastal defense doctrines of the forces arrayed against them, specifically focusing on the Iraqi military apparatus occupying Kuwait in 1990 and 1991. Saddam Hussein knew that the United States Marine Corps possessed the most potent amphibious assault capability on the planet. To counter the threat of a massive amphibious landing on the shores of Kuwait, the Iraqi military, utilizing Soviet doctrine and equipment, constructed one of the most dense, heavily fortified coastal defense networks since the Atlantic Wall in Normandy. They did not just dig trenches, they poured millions of tons of concrete. The Iraqi layered defense began far out in the waters of the Persian Gulf. They deployed thousands of naval mines, including the LUGM-145 contact mines, and sophisticated Italian-made Manta acoustic and magnetic bottom mines. These minefields were designed to channel American warships into pre-planned kill zones. Overlooking these kill zones were batteries of Soviet-built HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles. The Silkworm was a massive, truck-sized missile carrying a 1,100-pound shaped charge warhead capable of sinking a modern cruiser with a single hit. Behind the missile batteries, the Iraqis dug in hundreds of artillery pieces, primarily Soviet 130mm and 152mm field guns. These were not simply parked in the sand. They were entombed in reinforced concrete bunkers, with only the barrels protruding toward the sea, rendering them virtually immune to airburst fragmentation munitions or light naval gunfire. Further inland, entire Iraqi infantry divisions were entrenched in a massive network of bunkers, spider holes, and anti-tank ditches filled with crude oil, ready to be ignited into walls of fire. This was the reality of the battle space. How do you crack a defensive line that is buried under 10 feet of sand and concrete, protected by minefields, and bristling with anti-ship missiles? You do not send a billion-dollar Aegis cruiser to trade shots with a concrete bunker. You send the battleships. The tactical doctrine of naval gunfire support, or NGFS, is a brutal mathematical equation. When an Iowa-class battleship turns broadside to the coast, it brings 9 16-inch guns to bear. Let us break down the mechanical reality of this weapon system, because the sheer scale of the engineering is difficult to comprehend. Each gun barrel is 66 feet long and weighs 267,000 pounds. Loading one of these guns is a complex, dangerous ballet of heavy machinery and human muscle, requiring a crew of over 70 to 100 men per turret. First, the 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell, or the 1,900-pound high-capacity explosive shell, is hoisted up from the armored magazines deep in the bowels of the ship. A massive mechanical rammer shoves the projectile into the breech. Then, the gun crew manually loads 6 silk bags of D846 smokeless powder behind the shell. Each bag weighs 110 pounds. That is 660 pounds of highly volatile propellant per shot. When the breech block slams shut and the gun fires, the pressure inside the chamber reaches 50,000 pounds per square inch. The recoil pushes the massive gun barrel back 4 feet, absorbed by massive hydraulic cylinders, while the ship itself physically moves sideways in the water from the sheer kinetic force. The high-capacity shell, designed specifically for shore bombardment, carries 153 pounds of composition A3 high explosive. When it detonates on a soft target, it creates a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep, instantly clearing minefields, vaporizing barbed wire, and collapsing the lungs of enemy infantry entrenched hundreds of yards away. When it strikes a reinforced concrete bunker, the sheer kinetic energy of the nearly 2,000-pound mass traveling at supersonic speeds shatters the concrete before the delayed action fuse detonates the explosive charge deep inside the structure. But having massive guns is useless if you cannot hit the target. This brings us to the most fascinating juxtaposition of technology aboard the reactivated Iowas. Deep inside the armored citadel of the ship sat the Ford Instrument Company Mark VIII Rangekeeper. This was an analog mechanical computer, a marvel of brass gears, cams, and dials designed in the 1930s. It took inputs from the ship's optical rangefinders, factored in the ship's speed, the target speed, wind direction, humidity, the rotation of the Earth, and even the temperature of the powder bags in the magazine. It mechanically calculated the firing solution with a level of precision that rivaled early digital computers. In the 1980s, The Navy integrated this mechanical genius with modern surface search radars and, crucially, the RQ-2 Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle. Instead of relying on a fragile spotter plane or a forward observer hiding in the brush, the battleship could launch a small drone to loiter directly over the enemy positions. The drone beamed live video back to the ship, allowing the gunners to watch their massive shells impact in real time and adjust their fire with terrifying accuracy. Sometimes the best solution to a complex geopolitical problem is placing 2,000 pounds of high explosive exactly where the enemy is trying to eat his breakfast. But the logistics of sustaining this level of firepower are a nightmare. A battleship consumes fuel oil at a prodigious rate, and its magazines hold roughly 1,200 16-inch shells. During sustained shore bombardment, those magazines can be emptied in a matter of days. This requires underway replenishment, a dangerous maneuver where an ammunition ship steams alongside the battleship at a distance of only 100 feet. Cables are strung between the two ships, and pallets of 2,700-pound shells are transferred across the churning water via highline, while both ships maintain a speed of 15 knots. It is an incredible feat of seamanship and raw physical labor as sailors maneuver these massive munitions into the battleship's handling rooms using manual chain hoists and brute force. The United States possess the only naval logistics train in the world capable of feeding these steel beasts while deployed thousands of miles from home. The Iraqi forces, sitting in their bunkers in Kuwait, had no conception of the logistical and industrial avalanche that was about to fall upon them. They had studied the Iran-Iraq War, they understood static trench warfare, and they believed their coastal defenses were impenetrable. They assumed the threat of sea mines and Silkworm missiles would keep the American fleet far out in the deep waters of the Gulf, limiting the bombardment to expensive cruise missiles and carrier airstrikes, which they believed they could weather in their deep bunkers. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the weapon system that was steaming toward their coastline. The battleship does not care about your concrete. The battleship does not care about your layered defense. As the USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin formed up with their escorts and began their final approach toward the Kuwaiti coastline in early 1991, the crews went to general quarters. The massive steel blast doors were sealed, the engineering spaces were pressurized, and the gun captains in the 16-inch turrets began their final checks. They were about to sail deliberately into a heavily mined, shallow-water combat zone, placing themselves directly in the crosshairs of enemy anti-ship missile batteries, all to deliver a message written in high explosive and deafening thunder. Steaming into the northern Persian Gulf was a navigational nightmare. The draft of an Iowa-class battleship fully loaded for combat is nearly 38 feet deep. The waters off the coast of Kuwait are notoriously shallow, littered with shifting sandbars, unpredictable currents, and treacherous shoals. We are talking about maneuvering a vessel that weighs 45,000 tons and stretches 887 feet long in a bathtub filled with high explosives. This is where the theoretical majesty of blue water naval doctrine violently collides with the muddy, claustrophobic reality of littoral combat. To understand the tactical execution of this firepower, we have to look at the severe mechanical limitations of the weapons themselves. The 16-inch 50 caliber Mark VII naval rifle is a masterpiece of destructive engineering, but it has a finite lifespan. The violent expansion of superheated gases required to push a 2,700-pound projectile out of the barrel at 2,500 feet per second causes severe erosion of the steel rifling. After approximately 300 full-charge rounds, the interior of the barrel becomes so degraded that the shell loses its ballistic stability, wobbling in flight and destroying the weapon's legendary accuracy. Gun captains meticulously logged every single shot, factoring this microscopic barrel wear into the mechanical fire control computers to adjust the firing solution. This is not a video game where ammunition is unlimited and weapons never degrade. This is the brutal physics of heavy artillery, requiring constant mathematical correction and logistical foresight. How do you project overwhelming naval gunfire against a fortified coastline when the enemy has spent 6 months turning the shallow approaches into a maritime minefield? You do it with agonizing patience and highly vulnerable, disposable assets. The Iraqi military had deployed thousands of contact and influence mines, creating a layered defense designed to rip the keel out of any approaching warship. Before the battleships could even get within their 23-mile firing range, a vanguard of aggressive low-tech minesweepers had to clear a path. Helicopters towing magnetic sleds and wooden-hulled mine countermeasures ships swept the murky waters, detonating threats that could cripple a billion-dollar vessel. The battleships followed slowly in these swept channels, confined to narrow, predictable boxes. This lack of maneuverability stripped the battleship of its primary defense against modern threats, which is speed and open ocean evasion. They were essentially parked in a driveway, daring the enemy coastal defense batteries to shoot at them. We saw a similar terrifying dynamic during the American Civil War at the siege of Vicksburg, where Union ironclads had to navigate the narrow, treacherous bends of the Mississippi River while under plunging fire from Confederate shore batteries. The environment dictated the engagement, forcing massive warships into confined spaces where their superior firepower could be brought to bear, but at immense risk to the crews. Similarly, at the amphibious assault on Iwo Jima in 1945, American battleships had to anchor dangerously close to the shoreline to deliver direct, flat trajectory fire against Japanese bunkers carved into Mount Suribachi, because aerial bombardment had completely failed to penetrate the volcanic rock. The Persian Gulf in 1991 demanded that same dangerous proximity to the shoreline. On February 4, 1991, the USS Missouri unleashed the first combat firing of her main battery since the Korean War. The target was an Iraqi command and control bunker complex located deep inside occupied Kuwait. The firing sequence of a battleship is a sensory overload that defies basic human comprehension. The sheer overpressure from the muzzle blast will literally crush the sinuses and rupture the eardrums of anyone caught on the weather deck without proper acoustic protection. The massive shells arced through the stratosphere, taking over a minute of flight time to reach their target. When they impacted, the Earth simply liquefied. The Iraqi bunkers were built to withstand 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs dropped from strike aircraft, which rely primarily on blast fragmentation. But a 16-inch armor-piercing shell is a completely different animal. It is a solid mass of hardened steel that uses raw kinetic energy to punch through reinforced concrete before a delayed fuse detonates its internal explosive charge deep underground. The Missouri's barrage systematically disassembled the Iraqi command complex, turning millions of dollars of Soviet-designed fortifications into a smoking crater of pulverized concrete and twisted rebar. The true force multiplier in this engagement, however, was a piece of technology that looked like an oversized model airplane. The AAIRQ-2 Pioneer was a lightweight unmanned aerial vehicle powered by a 26-horsepower two-stroke engine. It sounded exactly like a flying lawnmower. Launched from the fantail of the battleship using a solid rocket booster, the Pioneer flew at an altitude of 4,000 feet, carrying a stabilized high-resolution television camera. It orbited directly over the Iraqi positions, virtually immune to most ground fire due to its small radar cross-section and composite construction. What happens to the psychology of an entrenched infantryman when he realizes that an invisible ship 20 miles away can drop a Volkswagen-sized piece of high explosive directly into his trench line with pinpoint accuracy? The psychological collapse of the defending force is absolute. The most dramatic demonstration of this occurred during the bombardment of Faylaka Island. The island was heavily garrisoned by Iraqi forces operating batteries of 152mm artillery. These Soviet-built field guns had a range of about 10 miles, meaning the battleships could sit comfortably outside their reach. The USS Wisconsin arrived on station and immediately launched her Pioneer drone to hunt for targets. The drone identified the Iraqi artillery positions, which were perfectly camouflaged and dug deep into the sand dunes. The mechanical computers on the Wisconsin digested the coordinates relayed by the drone operators. The 16-inch guns roared to life. The drone's live video feed showed the massive high-capacity shells erasing the Iraqi artillery batteries from the map, one grid square at a time. The Iraqi soldiers quickly learned to associate the buzzing sound of the Pioneer drone's two-stroke engine with imminent, inescapable death. In one of the most surreal moments of modern warfare, a group of Iraqi soldiers on Faylaka Island heard the drone approaching, realized they were being targeted by the battleship, and frantically began waving white flags at the unmanned aircraft. It was the first time in recorded military history that human troops surrendered to a robot. They knew that if the drone saw them, the 16-inch guns would speak, and there was no bunker deep enough to save them from the impending steel rain. But the enemy coastal defense network was not entirely helpless. On February 25th, the Iraqi forces decided they had suffered enough punishment from the offshore bombardment. They tracked the massive radar signature of the USS Missouri sitting in its swept-fire support box. From a camouflaged launcher hidden on the coastline, they fired two HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles directly at the battleship. The Silkworm is a terrifying piece of Cold War hardware. It is 31 feet long, weighs over 6,000 pounds, and carries a massive 1,100-pound shaped charge warhead. It flies at nearly the speed of sound, skimming just a few hundred feet above the waves to avoid early radar detection. If one of those missiles hit a modern, thin-skinned destroyer, it would snap the ship in half and send it to the bottom in minutes. If it hit the Missouri, the battleship's heavy armor would likely prevent a sinking, but the sheer explosive force could wipe out the unarmored superstructure, destroying the radar arrays, killing dozens of sailors, and completely blinding the ship. The Missouri's electronic warfare suites instantly detected the incoming threat. The ship immediately fired massive clouds of radar-absorbent chaff to confuse the missile's seeker head, while the phalanx close-in weapon systems spun up to engage. But the true hero of this engagement was the British Royal Navy. The Type 42 destroyer, HMS Gloucester, was acting as a radar picket ship, screening the battleship from aerial threats. The Gloucester's advanced radar locked on to the incoming Silkworm missile. In a fraction of a second, the British warship launched two Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles. The Sea Darts accelerated to Mach 2, intercepting the lead Silkworm a mere 700 yards from the port side of the USS Missouri. The explosion lit up the early morning sky, showering the ocean with flaming debris and sending a massive shockwave across the water. It was the first successful combat intercept of an incoming anti-ship missile by a surface-to-air missile in naval history. The second Silkworm lost its radar lock due to the Missouri's chaff countermeasures and crashed harmlessly into the sea. The battleships had survived the ultimate test of modern anti-access capabilities, proving that heavy armor and massive kinetic firepower still held a brutal relevance in the missile age. But as the ground war known as Operation Desert Sabre was about to launch, the Marine Corps required even closer fire support, forcing these steel leviathans to navigate deeper into the deadly shallows where the margin for error was exactly zero. The ground offensive, designated Operation Desert Sabre, commenced in the early hours of February 24, 1991. Coalition armored columns were sweeping across the desert floor, and the United States Marine Corps was tasked with breaching the heavily fortified Iraqi obstacle belts in southern Kuwait. They required continuous, devastating, all-weather fire support to keep the defending Iraqi infantry suppressed in their bunkers. Carrier-based aviation is incredibly lethal, but jet fighters possess limited loiter time and can be grounded by the severe sandstorms that frequently blind the Arabian Peninsula. A 16-inch naval rifle, however, does not care about sandstorms, cloud cover, or low visibility. To provide this unbroken umbrella of kinetic destruction, the battleships had to push even closer to the hostile shoreline, entering waters so shallow that their massive bronze propellers were literally churning up mud from the sea floor. The draft of a fully loaded Iowa-class battleship is nearly 38 feet, and they were operating in coastal shelves that were barely 40 feet deep. The massive seawater intakes, designed to cool the ship's 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, began sucking up sand and bottom debris, threatening to overheat the engineering plants and leave the ships dead in the water. This was a calculated, terrifying risk. If a battleship ran aground within range of Iraqi shore batteries, it would become a 45,000-ton stationary target, an absolute political and military disaster. Why take such a colossal risk when you have a fleet of destroyers armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles sitting safely in deep water? The answer lies in the brutal economics of tactical fire support. A BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missile in 1991 cost roughly $1.2 million. It is a strategic weapon designed to strike high-value fixed targets like power plants, command bunkers, and radar installations deep inland. You do not fire a $1 million cruise missile at a trench line of conscript infantry or a single dug-in artillery piece. Furthermore, a Tomahawk takes time to program, requires complex satellite waypoints, and has a flight time measured in hours. Conversely, a 16-inch high-capacity explosive shell costs just a few $1,000s, mostly representing the cost of the propellant and the logistical effort to move it. When a Marine forward observer called for fire, the battleship's analog computers could calculate the ballistic trajectory in seconds, and a 2,000-pound shell would arrive on target less than 2 minutes later. This brings us to a fundamental tactical lesson regarding the psychological weight of sustained artillery. We saw this same psychological dynamic during the War of 1812, when the British Royal Navy bombarded Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. The British used massive mortar vessels and Congreve rockets to rain continuous heavy ordnance on the American defenders for 25 straight hours. While the physical damage to the Star Fort was surprisingly light, the psychological intent was to break the will of the garrison through the sheer, inescapable terror of continuous explosions. The Iraqi forces in Kuwait experienced a magnified, mechanized version of this terror. The battleships did not just drop one bomb and fly away like a strike aircraft. They loitered offshore for days, delivering a crushing blow every 30 seconds, systematically erasing grid squares and turning concrete bunkers into mass graves. The psychological collapse was so complete that entire Iraqi battalions abandoned their heavily fortified defensive lines the moment they heard the supersonic crack of the incoming naval shells, choosing the uncertainty of the open desert over the absolute certainty of being vaporized in their trenches. But the logistical reality of maintaining this level of destruction is where the battleship concept ultimately fails in the modern era. Let us examine the multidimensional nightmare of feeding the beast. To keep the USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin firing, the United States Navy had to rely on a highly specialized, incredibly vulnerable logistical umbilical cord. The Sacramento-class fast combat support ships were massive, heavily laden supply vessels that had to steam directly into the combat zone to resupply the battleships. Transferring 2,700-pound projectiles and pallets of highly volatile, smokeless powder via highline cables between two ships pitching in the ocean swells is one of the most dangerous evolutions in naval operations. Furthermore, the industrial base required to support these weapons no longer existed. The Navy was firing ammunition and powder bags that had been manufactured during World War II and the Korean War, pulled from deep storage bunkers in places like Hawthorne, Nevada. The D-846 smokeless powder degrades over time, and the chemical instability of aging propellant is a terrifying variable when you are packing 660 pounds of it into a sealed steel breech. The tragic explosion inside turret number 2 of the USS Iowa in 1989, which killed 47 sailors, was a grim reminder of the inherent dangers of operating half-century-old artillery systems. From an economic and political standpoint, the massive manpower requirements of the Iowa class became impossible to justify. An Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, equipped with the Aegis combat system, can track hundreds of targets simultaneously, launch land attack cruise missiles, and shoot down ballistic missiles in space, all with a crew of roughly 330 sailors. An Iowa-class battleship requires a crew of nearly 1,500 officers and enlisted men just to keep the boilers lit, the brass polished, and the massive gun turrets manned. In an era of shrinking defense budgets and the collapse of the Soviet Union, dedicating that amount of human capital to a single hull that was essentially a specialized shore bombardment platform was an economic absurdity. This shift in naval architecture mirrors the historical transition we witnessed during the American Civil War at the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862. When the ironclad CSS Virginia decimated the wooden-hulled Union warships, it instantly rendered every wooden ship of the line in the world obsolete. The paradigm shifted from the volume of cannons to the thickness of armor and the power of steam. Similarly, the Gulf War proved that the era of the big gun battleship was over, not because the guns were ineffective, but because the precision, range, and efficiency of the microchip had fundamentally altered the geometry of naval warfare. We can also compare this late-stage deployment to the use of the USS New Jersey during the Vietnam War in 1968. During Operation Sea Dragon, the New Jersey fired thousands of rounds into the Vietnamese jungle, but her effectiveness was often limited by the lack of precise targeting data and the difficulty of spotting fall of shot in dense canopy. 23 years later, in the Persian Gulf, the integration of the pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle and SEAL teams utilizing laser target designators ashore bridge the gap between analog firepower and digital intelligence. The battleship became a node in a networked battlespace, taking real-time data from a drone and feeding it into a mechanical brass computer designed before the invention of the transistor. It was a brilliant temporary hack of military technology, a violent swan song for the dreadnought era. On February 28, 1991, the USS Wisconsin fired the final naval gunfire support mission of the war. As the massive breech block swung open and the smoke cleared from the turret, a profound silence fell over the gun crew. They had just fired the last combat projectile from a battleship in the history of the United States Navy. The massive 16-inch guns, which had bombarded the beaches of Normandy, the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the frozen mountains of Korea, and the jungles of Vietnam, would never speak in anger again. The ships were ordered back to the United States, their massive magazines emptied, their boilers cooled, and their crews dispersed to the modern fleet of nuclear submarines and guided missile cruisers. They were decommissioned and transformed into floating museums, silent sentinels of a bygone era of industrial warfare. The deployment of the Iowa-class battleships in the Gulf War was not a nostalgic publicity stunt. It was a highly lethal, calculated application of overwhelming kinetic force designed to solve a specific tactical problem. They cracked the concrete of the Iraqi coastal defenses, shattered the morale of the defending infantry, and proved that even in the age of the silicon chip, there is no substitute for the raw, blunt force trauma of a 2,000-pound armor-piercing shell. Warfare is a ruthless editor, constantly deleting the obsolete to make room for the efficient. But occasionally, the old tools are pulled from the shed because sometimes you do not need a scalpel. You just need a very large hammer. Here is a question for the tactical analysts in the comments. If you were a defense planner facing a heavily fortified, modern island defense network today, which asset would you prioritize for the initial bombardment? A. A massive swarm of cheap expendable loitering munitions. B. A fleet of stealth bombers dropping precision-guided bunker busters. C. A modernized, automated railgun cruiser capable of delivering high-volume kinetic strikes from over the horizon. Let us know your tactical reasoning in the comments below, and make sure you are subscribed for our next deep dive into the mechanics of warfare.